My name is David Sandalow. I am the Inaugural Fellow at Columbia's Center for Global Energy Policy. And we are delighted to be hosting a session today on solar power, net metering, and the utility business model. This is one of a series of meetings and public events that the Center for Global Energy Policy has been hosting in the past months. Thank you for those who have been coming to some of our events. They're certainly getting a lot of interest. Under the leadership of our director, Jason Bordoff, the center has grown enormously since it was launched just about a year ago. If you're not on our mailing list and you would like to be on our mailing list, please come find me or some of our folks standing outside, and we'll make sure you're on the mailing list for more events. Solar power is exploding in growth around the world and in the United States. We've seen record levels of installation in the past year, 4 gigawatts here and actually in China, almost 3 times that. If you look at the cost curves for this technology, the pretty robust projections are for continued steady declines in the cost of solar power in the years ahead. And that has very significant implications for utilities and the way they deliver electricity to all of us. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'm delighted that we have 2 really first-class experts here who are going to start. They're each going to give us about 10 to 15-minute presentation. Then we will have a conversation. And they both have said to me they'd like to have more of a conversation than just talk at you. So, but I think I want to lay the groundwork. There's just because you're here, we don't necessarily we didn't make a knowledge about solar power and the utility industry a prerequisite for walking in the room today. So we assumed that some of you would value just kind of a introduction to some of these issues. And then we'll have a conversation about them. So our first speaker is Rick Tempchin, who's the Executive Director for Retail Energy Services at the Edison Electric Institute. Rick joined EEI in 1987, and I can say from my experience knowing Rick over the years, he is knowledgeable and proficient in a very wide range of topics relating to utilities, including retail energy services, customer service, operations and marketing, and energy storage, much more. He has a BS in marketing from the University of Maryland and an MBA in energy management from the University of Denver. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thanks, sir. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Can you hear me okay in the back? Good, thanks. Like David said, I'm with the Edison Electric Institute. So who is Edison Electric Institute, or the EEI as we're called? We're the trade association of the investor-owned electric utility industry. Our members, Con Ed in New York City is one of our members. Our members serve about 70% of the electricity sold in the United States. We have international affiliates and also industry suppliers who are members as associate members. We do public policy leadership. We're in Washington, D.C. We also do business intelligence, and we do a lot of forums and collaborations, meetings like this. Thomas Edison there, nice signature. I need to work on a signature like that. So a century of innovation. Thomas Edison did start here in New York City in 1882. Fast forward for about 130 years, and the industry really has changed a lot since Edison, although there are a lot of things that are the same from Edison's times, and that's what we're doing right now is modernizing the grid, updating the system, and making it take advantage of new technologies. Just to give you a feel for how big this industry is, $160 billion is what the industry is worth, 2.2% of the GNP, and about 500,000 employees, and we spend $85 billion a year capital investment in the system, the electric system, generation, transmission, distribution to the home. And as we'll hear in a few minutes, and backwards these days, and that's the interesting thing, that's the change. Just to give you a feel for the evolving generation mix, things have changed very quickly over the past few years. As you can see right here, we're at 1993 to present. The top line, if you can't see that, is coal. Coal has come down dramatically over the past few years. Coal is the red pie chart here. So the share slice of pie for coal has come down aggressively. Natural gas has gone up dramatically. There was a little tick there based on gas prices, but a lot of people expect a convergence of these two graphs. So we'll see coal and natural gas converge at some point soon. Nuclear power is flat. Hydropower is about flat. But right here, right here, this purple line is renewables. And this is what a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, because a lot of the distributed resources on the customer side of the meter are renewables. Not all, but a lot of them are renewables. And that's one of the exciting technologies that we're going to talk about today. But there's a lot of regional diversity in the fuel mix, and this is something that everybody really needs to understand. As you might expect, we have a lot of coal in the Midwest, a lot of hydropower in the West Coast, particularly the Pacific Northwest right here, and a lot of natural gas in Texas and the South Central states. So electricity generation is very regionally diverse, and that's something that is very important, because where the resources are, that's where you want to use them most. In terms of renewables, you can see here we've got this is present day, a dramatic increase in renewables over the past few years. This is 1992. So the green slice is wind, solar is yellow, wood and biomass here, and geothermal here. So all of these renewable resources are growing dramatically, and I think we're going to continue to see more and more interest by electric utilities and renewable resources, and more and more on the customer side of the meter. We like to say that the utilities are leading the solar revolution. This dark blue area are utility scale photovoltaics. This is solar cells, and the slice here is commercial, and the light blue is residential. So as you can see, there's a diverse mix of solar cells or photovoltaics available in the system. So what does that all mean to greenhouse gas CO2 emissions intensity? As you can see here, this is dramatically declining. This is year 2000 and 2012. So at this point today, we're at 15% below 2005 levels in terms of CO2 emissions. A dramatic decline in CO2 emissions. I don't think anybody expects this will continue to drop. It may level off a little bit depending on new rules and regulations that we're going to be seeing through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So to really get to the part about the grid, what is the grid? Like I said, basically the wires, the big wires, the transmission lines, and the small wires, the distribution lines that you see out on the utility poles out here. Actually, most of this is underground, so maybe not a good example here in Manhattan, but we're talking about the wires that deliver electricity. And what's happening is we're making a lot of investments, transforming the grid, as we like to say, to harden the grid. I don't have to tell you all about the hurricanes, and to make them more resilient. So when there is an outage, we get back up and get the lights back on faster than ever. Synchro phasers, feeder switches, sensors, voltage regulators, communications equipment, smart meters. You may have heard about smart meters. All of these things enable us to harden the system, make it more resilient, and make it more reliable, so we can deal with new technologies like electricity storage, batteries, for example, which are getting better and better and cheaper. Electric vehicles here, one of my favorites. I drive a Chevy Volt. Any electric vehicle drivers here? Oh, good. Perfect. A couple. We're going to see more and more of those, and we're going to actually see electric vehicles charging their batteries and then sending the electricity back to the home and back to the grid eventually. as a resource for both the home and for the grid. So these are the exciting things that are happening. Some things will happen faster than others, but I think you're going to see more and more of this innovation coming through the system. This is one of my favorite graphics. We're talking about the integrated grid here. So this is the grid as it is today. It's a one-way system. It goes from generation through transmission, distribution to the homes, businesses. Very simple system here. Well, not that simple, but relatively simple compared to what we're talking about now is an integrated grid where we have generation coming from all places, from homes, businesses, neighborhoods, into the grid and being dispatched economically, cleanly, and efficiently through the system. And this is a big transition, but we feel that we need to make these kind of investments. Some places they'll make these investments faster than others, depending on the resource needs and depending on the needs of the state. A lot of this work is regulated by state utility commissioners, mostly appointed by governors or elected. About 15 out of the 50 states have elected commissioners, utility commissioners that set rates and set the rules for utility investments and prices. So we're going to go from a one-way system to a two-way system, two-way power flow, and two-way communications. The two-way communications is an important part of this because we have sensors on the system that know where the weak spots are, send electricity to the right place, and make the investments where it's needed. Not all places on the grid need investments as much or as fast as others. There are weak spots and there are stronger spots. And there are other factors contributing to the transition. It's not on here, but I like to talk about, okay, cell phones. You're out of electricity. You can put on light a candle, but if you don't have your cell phone, you're not too happy. So backup batteries. There are other ways to deal with concerns, but customers really need more reliability than ever. The idea electricity is becoming more and more valuable to everyone, and high quality electricity is also very important. In the old days when we had analog systems, surges and spikes weren't so noticeable. These days we have a much more sensitive end-use technology on the customer side that doesn't like surges and sags and poor power quality. So these are some of the things that we need because customers demand them. They also demand choice and have preferences for self-supply. People like the idea of having control over their bills and over their electricity use, and we're working to make sure that we can accommodate those customer needs. And also I talked about the smart infrastructure, smart meters, and the smart system that everyone can benefit from. We also like to say the grid is in the center of this transition. The grid is the backbone, it's the infrastructure that makes all of these new technologies and new products and services, electricity products and services available. Transfers and transactions, so that's the money going back and forth. The meter that we have now, that's basically a cash register. It's a very relatively simple machine. We're going to have to transform to a place where we can do commerce through the grid, and that's going to be a big change. We also have the need to balance supply and demand, voltage frequency services. Like I said, power quality issues are very important, and energy backup. If customers have their own generation, I actually like to say that the grid is the front up, not the backup. In other words, the grid is the place where there's 100% access, 24/7 use of the grid. And so we have this back and forth between electrons going through the system. This is a graph. Let me see if I can use this graph to explain, or this chart to explain the utility system in a way that will stimulate some discussion later on. This is 24 hours in a day in a home, a typical home, U.S. home. Utility provides the power here. This is what we call a load curve, okay? This is the customer's demand for electricity. So they need more in the morning, down a little later in the day, and it peaks in the evening about 7 o'clock typically in a U.S. home. This is a home with a small solar photovoltaic or solar cells on the roof. The sun comes up nicely, it peaks here and it goes back down. But throughout the whole process, the customer's using the grid. Clouds come over and different things happen. This is not, it's not the only way that solar comes onto the system. Sometimes clouds come over, it drops off and it comes back up again. So the customer's use is always with the grid. Customers are always connected unless you typically live way out beyond where the grid reaches. You can self-generate possibly, and maybe Carrie will talk about that a little bit with battery backup. But typically, customers are going to be connected to the grid, and they use the grid 24/7. And they, you know, one of our concerns is that customers who don't use the grid certain times of the day, they need to pay for their use of the grid because they're using it at all times. I'm going to skip a couple of these. And I'm just going to use this as an example, you know, and we'll talk about policy a little bit. You may have heard about the European experience in Germany. You know, well-intentioned policies sometimes have unintended consequences. Germany went very far and very strong on renewable energy with very big subsidies that allowed their renewable portfolio to grow very rapidly. And unfortunately, their prices almost doubled to customers. The retail customers went from 18 cents a kilowatt hour to 37 cents a kilowatt hour from the year 2000 to 2013. And now they're in a crisis mode here. Just for context, the average U.S. residential price is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. You know, nobody wants the U.S. Electricity prices to double to retail customers. So we're doing a lot of studying of the German experience to make sure we understand what they did right, what they did wrong, and make sure that we don't make those kind of mistakes. So this is, you know, shaping the future. We have new opportunities here. Here's the grid in the center of things. We have new utility business models. We have regulatory models that are going to change through state utility commissions. And we have changing customer models. In other words, customers having more and different demands from their electric system. And a lot of people are working to accommodate this. We just had a seminar upstairs this morning. A lot of smart people in the room, about 25 people in the room, all talking about how to transform things, how to make the system better, and how to move in the direction that, that everyone wants us to go to. I'm getting ready to close here, but I want to talk for a minute about what electricity is really worth. I said, you know, 10 cents a kilowatt hour. You know, who knows what that gets you? 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Does anybody know how many kilowatt hours you need to charge your phone, to run your refrigerator? Nobody knows. Okay, everybody pays an electric bill. Nobody really knows what they're buying, how they're buying it. They pay a bill. They know maybe it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Here in New York, it's a lot higher than that. That's the national average. But you know, you probably don't really know what that costs you in terms of the value that you get from it. So just an example, just for fun, I did this for refrigerators. So a refrigerator is about 525 kilowatt hours per year. So what does that mean? Per year, that's about $60. So if I asked you, if you, talking about the value of electricity, would it be worth it for you to unplug your refrigerator for a year to get $60? Probably not. Well, what is that worth? What is a year's worth of cold beer worth to you? Or foods that don't spoil? That's worth a lot of money. That's not how we price electricity. We price it by the kilowatt hour. These kind of things are changing. We're evolving this system, but this is a system that has worked very well over the years. You may feel that you pay a lot for electricity, but you get a lot of value out of it. And that's the point I want to make, is because we price electricity in a way that keeps prices reasonable, keeps prices relatively flat. And the pricing system is evolving a lot, and you'll see some changes, but hopefully we'll keep those prices reasonable, and you'll get more and better services out of it. So that's my conclusion. We'll have time for questions and answers and a panel discussion later. Thank you.
Rick, that was great. Many, many thanks for teeing up these issues and for that great introduction. It's now my delight to introduce Carrie Hitt, who is the Senior Vice President for State Affairs at the Solar Energy Industries Association. Carrie was previously president of the Solar Alliance, which merged with SEIA, as it's called, in 2012. Prior to joining the Solar Alliance, she was vice president at Constellation Energy, so she's very deep experience in this industry. She has an undergraduate degree from Clark University and an MA from School of Advanced International Studies, SICE, at Johns Hopkins. Welcome, Carrie.
Okay, so as Richard alluded, we were actually upstairs this morning with colleagues talking about, what's happening, not just in the solar industry, but also with distributed generation and changes to the grid and how that's impacting the, I guess I would say, historical, traditional model that's existed here in the U.S. I'm going to focus a little bit on what's happening in the solar industry and more specifically on what's going on with distributed generation today. But I hope that our conversation might envelop a little bit more about what's the context that we're dealing with across the U.S. As Richard pointed out, and I think it's important to make sure you all understand this, in the U.S., our retail rates are regulated at the state level. And I think you mentioned this. Wholesale rates, what happens, with the larger power plants and the business exchange that goes on there is really governed at the national level. So keep that in the back of your mind while we have this conversation. Also, the dynamic that we do have a couple hundred investor-owned utilities. Some are still vertically integrated, meaning they own the distribution system. They might own generation as well. In some parts of the country, and I'll show you a map in a minute, the utilities are only distribution companies now, and that's a big responsibility, but they no longer own generation. And that happened about 20 years ago. And that framework is sort of setting the stage a little bit for the conversations we're having now, is what is the role of the utility? What's the role of solar companies and distributed generation companies in the markets across the U.S., which vary significantly in some instances where you have traditional model with the utility that's vertically integrated. They're still involved in producing and selling generation. They still have rate regulation, and then distribution companies, which have rate regulation, but they're really only focused on the wires. And that's kind of the backdrop for the conversation I think we're going to have today. So let me just mention SEIA, because I think it gives you a picture of the industry. We're a longstanding trade association, kind of the equivalent to EEI on the solar side. We represent around 800 different companies in the U.S., from small companies that may just have a few folks that are starting up either a software business or a small installation company, all the way to some of the national companies that are publicly traded that you may have heard about. So our members consist of companies like Solar City, someone who's here today from Solar City, you may have heard about them. They're often in the press and media, and our national company, Sungevity, who is here with me upstairs this morning. SunPower is another provider. And then, of course, there are a whole host of manufacturers, investors, and financial entities that participate in the SEIA conversation, are members of ours. We're active around the U.S. The work that I do, which is at the state level, is mostly focused on a dozen states, and that's just a reflection of resource constraints. We try to help in other markets, but we're really focused on the markets that are expanding and growing and trying to change other markets and open them up over time. In the solar industry today, there are 140,000 workers involved in the solar market, and I think upstairs someone gave a comparison that I think coal industry currently has around 60,000 employees here in the U.S. So just to give you kind of a gauge about how many folks are really involved in the solar markets, those are direct employees. Let's talk about what's been going on in the market. Every year we do an annual report, and then we do a quarterly report with a partner called Green Tech Media. I encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested in the space. It's a really good way to assess the various markets in the U.S. and who's doing what and what's happening. In 2013, it was a record year for solar installations. 4.7 megawatts, sorry, 4,700 megawatts, sorry, 4.7 gigawatts. New PV capacity was installed across the U.S. It covered a variety of different markets. As you can see here, California is consistently, or has been consistently in the lead, and that continued in 2013 in terms of new installations. But if I had another pie chart that showed, 5 years ago, California probably would have been 90% of that pie, and now it's, it's getting down there, and other states are becoming new markets and expanding and growing rapidly, and we have more geographic variety across the U.S. These are PV installations. For those of you that are interested, there are also about 410 megawatts of CSP, which is concentrated solar power. And I should say that SEIA, we work both for large-scale companies, CSP companies, as well as PV. Often, at least here on the East Coast, the conversation and the dialogue is dominated by PV, but CSP is an important part of the market, specifically in the Southwest. Cumulative capacity by state. This kind of gets to the point I was making before. So a couple things going on here in this slide. You can see the number of states that now have a PV capacity that's installed. And it covers all three market segments, really the big chunks of how we describe these markets, both residential, non-residential, and utility scale. Our members and folks in the industry really service all of these. Most of the residential systems are, I think you referred to this, Richard, behind the meter, customer-sited systems. They're what's called often net metering, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Non-residential systems, which might be behind the meter, or they may be outside of that framework. Those are customers that are like your Whole Foods or your BJ's or your universities and colleges and school campuses are customers that fall into that category. And then utility scale. These are the larger projects you might think about that might be anywhere from 5 to 10 megawatts to a couple hundred megawatts, some of the larger installations that exist out in the western part of the country. Here in New York State, we refer to utility scale, and sometimes that might be a project that's maybe 10 or 18 megawatts. So relative size to what's going on in other parts of the country might be a little bit smaller, but the framework is the same in that it's a system that's connected at the wholesale level to the grid, and we would call that utility scale for the most part. This is cumulative capacity by states. Let me point that out too. So what we saw on the first slide was what happened last year in 2013 with 4,700 megawatts of PV installations. This slide is showing you how many megawatts we have overall in each of these segments. So for the residential sector, at the end of 2013, we saw around 2,200 megawatts, non-residential 4,000 megawatts total, and then utility scale, of course, at around 6,800 nationwide. We expect this number, the cumulative number, to grow significantly in 2014. Again, I think the projections are somewhere from between 4,000 and 6,000 additional megawatts to be added to the grid this year. In 2013, the additions of 4,700 megawatts made solar the second most, or I always get these adjectives in the wrong order, but the second largest new generation capacity source in the U.S., second only to natural gas. So whereas maybe 15 or 20 years ago, that number might have been a coal facility or some other fossil fuel plant, would have been the majority of new generation built in the U.S. Now it's natural gas and it's solar. So I wanted to focus a little bit about net metering. Has anyone in the audience heard about net metering before? Okay, good. That's good. Good understanding. Sean, you can't raise your hand. Net metering is an important construct, and Richard referred a little bit to this. It actually facilitates distributed generation. In distributed generation are the projects that you see or you hear about that are on a customer site that are what we call behind the meter. They're connected to the grid, but they're connected at the retail level. And net metering is a construct, and I'm going to show you a chart in a minute, that exists in a number of states, in a majority of states, that allows that customer or developer of that system to receive a retail credit for the power that they are putting on the grid. And I think you explained how it works in terms of during the day and later in the day. It's an important policy tool that's helped facilitate all those installations that I talked about. It results in customers, and it takes different shapes and forms in different states, but ultimately receiving a retail credit on their bill that reflects the power that they put on the grid. Where does net metering exist? As I said, it exists in a number of states. Notably, it is not a construct that is in Texas, and Texas does not have a very large, at all, competitive distributed generation market yet. That might change over time. This is a complicated map, but an important one. It shows the various rules that exist. Some states have a cap on how much net metering can happen overall by state, or it might have a cap on the system, the project size that can access net metering. There are different rules that govern this space. For those of you that are interested in this conversation, not just as it relates to net metering, but some of the other rules, I would draw your attention to the website that I have listed up there, Desire, D-S-I-R-E. It's a great space to look up kind of facts and figures and policies as it relates to what's happening in the renewable space. They have a number of maps like this that show you current policy frameworks for renewable portfolio standards, for distributed generation, and other things. So just as an aside, because we're at a facility of higher education, it's a great resource for anybody looking into this for more detail. Richard also mentioned, retail rates around the country and average retail rates, and I want to mention that it's not necessarily by design, but it's no big mystery why, it's the states that have the most solar are the ones that are on the coast, and the ones typically anyway. So I mentioned California and New Jersey and the Southeast a little bit. Obviously they have a lot of sun there, but why does California, why does New Jersey, why does Massachusetts, and New York now, why are they promoting solar? Why do they have net metering policies that are typically more generous than what might exist in the other parts of the state? And the reason is really, it's quite historical, is that the retail rates in those regions of the country are quite high. And they're high, the prices that you and I pay for electricity relative to maybe the middle part of the country or the southeastern part of the country. There are a number of reasons for that, just infrastructure costs, high generation costs. They have to import all their fuel. They don't have domestic resources. There are a number of different reasons for that, but historically, those regions have had high retail rates. So when people started thinking about renewables, and maybe they're thinking about it for environmental reasons and things like that, they were also thinking about it, policymakers were also thinking about it from a price perspective. And those higher retail rates actually created a little bit of a cushion, I think, to kind of flex their arms and spread their wings a little bit when it comes to distributed generation policies. And so net metering is very, I guess I would say, is a little bit more generous, typically, not always the case, in the northeastern states and in some of the western states, or in states where we have higher retail prices. In addition, in the southeast, where we also have a lot of solar, or southwest, where we have a lot of solar, there are other, factors there, right? Higher solar radiation, large open spaces, things like that that may contribute to having more solar constructed there. Also, not to mention, those are places, not universally true relative to other markets, but where you have a lot of load, a lot of demand, right? New York has a lot of demand. California has a lot of demand and growing load. So I just wanted to point out that if I had, I like to think about when we were kids, if you might recall having a picture of a skeleton, and you might have had a grammar school book that showed, the outline of a body, and then you layered over it, the bones and the organs and then the skin, and it was layers of things that, ultimately make the whole of who we are. I think about that when I think about solar policy in the U.S. If you were stripped this down, kind of what was the impetus for moving towards renewables, and why do we have certain policies in certain places? Yes, there are concerns about the climate, and policy folks are motivated by those concerns, but also it's about retail prices and thinking about what are we going to do in the future as we have more constraints on our other resources. So I talked a lot about the growth in solar and what's been going on in the past few years. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that even today, distributed solar and even large-scale solar is still a tiny, tiny fraction of overall retail sales around the U.S. So even in our largest markets, which are listed here, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Colorado, Massachusetts, Nevada, and New Jersey, DG is a really small percentage of the overall retail sales. Now, the expectation is, as costs come down dramatically, and I should say that I think last year we were at $2.50 a watt on average for per installation, and that's a dramatic decrease over the past 5 years. We expect the slice of this pie to get bigger, but we're still at a place where we're talking less than 1% penetration. That's the terminology that's used. In Hawaii, which is one of the most aggressive states, and there you have kind of a unique situation where they import all their fuels and it's a closed system, you're only at a few percentage points. So what's all the concern? Why are we seeing all this in the press? And what's the issue, right? Gee, it's not that much of a percentage that's, getting built yet, but yet there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of concern among policymakers, solar companies, investor-owned utilities about what is this all going to mean to the grid. I also want to point out, as we talk about that part of the concern is that, as you install distributed generation, you're exporting that back to the grid, and that has an impact on the grid. And it might have an economic impact, it might have a physical impact. That might be true, but at this point, we're still talking about relatively small percentages in terms of the exports that are going on the grid. So let's pause here for a second. What's the concern? What's happening? What's happening is prices are coming down. Distributed generation is being installed at exponential rates, even though it's still a small percentage of our overall retail sales. And that transformation that's happening is not unique to solar. We're starting to see it with other technologies on the grid and new technologies being added. And you've heard about electric vehicles and what's going to happen with electric vehicles and how they connect to the grid. This is creating a pretty broad conversation at the policy level around the U.S. about, well, what is this going to mean to the system that Richard talked about, that's based on investor-owned utilities for the most part, not universally, but for the most part, and the vertically integrated model or the rate cost of recovery model, the fact that every one of us has more or less a universal access to get electricity, and the electricity companies or the IOUs are obliged to provide that to us. How does DG perhaps disrupt that model? Does it change the economics? Does it change the physics of the system? So this map, which needs to be improved upon, it's a new map that I'm working on, is trying to show kind of where the conversations are taking place, where they're the most active conversations taking place about the transformation of the grid and what's happening with distributed generation. And the orange-colored states or rust-colored states are places where there's a net metering conversation. I would say it's not even a discussion. There's like a full litigated proceeding, or there's a legislative conversation going on about net metering. Going back to the previous few slides, all those places where there might be net metering caps or restrictions on net metering. Well, as we've grown in penetration, pressures are getting put on those net metering caps. Customers and solar companies are saying, hey, we want to be able to do more of this, but we're kind of restricted, maybe. We want to see more net metering. That's opening up a debate in these states. It's, I would say, a welcome debate on all sides of the equation. So in places like California, where there is rapid growth, there's talk about, well, last year there was talk about the net metering cap and raising the net metering cap. That was a legislative conversation. It occurred, there was legislation passed, which caused the Public Utilities Commission to think about raising that net metering cap and also changing rate design. That was kind of a corresponding issue. Same sort of conversations taking place around the country. What are our net metering guiding principles? I thought it would be important to state these, and they're, I think, important for people to understand the direction that we're coming from. Net metering, as I said, is a policy tool that facilitates distributed generation. Why is it important? First, because we think it's a right to self-generate. It allows customers to connect to the grid economically and ultimately can reduce grid electricity use. It looks at properly valuing solar electricity and adequately compensating solar customers. And therein lies some of the debate that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Does net metering properly value solar? Are customers getting compensated fairly, and are other customers that aren't solar customers paying too much, paying too little? What's the trade-off there for net metering? We want to make sure there's non-discriminatory practices with cost of service recovery, the cost of service recovery for the utilities, for the investments they make. We would argue that there should not be any net metering caps because you want to continue to facilitate distributed generation. That statewide application, this is a little nuanced, but we talked a lot about investor-owned utilities, but in fact, a third of the country is not, the electricity grid is not overseen or managed by IOUs. They're run by co-ops or local power authorities, and the rules there vary dramatically and are very different. I think everyone in the industry would argue for more transparency and access to data on the customer side and the utility side and the grid side and the solar side. We want to know more about what's going on, and there's new technology that allows us to see those things. And of course, we'd like to see best practices for net metering and distributed generation implemented across the state. I'm not going to spend time on my other slides, except to close with one of them and talk about some of the challenges and solutions that we have. As have been pointed out by Richard and myself, there's technological and use changes that are impacting the grid dramatically. It's not just solar. There are other things happening now that change the way the grid is being used and the economics of the grid. Customers should and do have more access to control to data in their own usage. The vertically integrated cost of service and the guaranteed rate of return model faces challenges, for better or for worse. It's just the new technology and customer choice challenges that historic model. I think all of us are starting to acknowledge that change is key, both in terms of grid economics and grid technology, and in terms of regulation. One of our main points, and I think there's a lot of agreement with the IOUs on this, is that changing how rates are designed is critical. And this might be a little too wonky for this crowd, but it does matter really in terms of the long-term viability of both the solar industry, the investor-owned utilities, and the benefits that customers see. And that is rates that we all pay need to be structured in a way that reflect the use that the customer is having on the grid, what they're using the grid for, and the full cost of that use, as well as any benefits that they may be providing to the grid and their fellow customers by having an electric vehicle, by having a smart inverter, by having a solar system, or participating in a community solar program, or what have you. Our rates are currently not structured in a way, generally speaking, are not structured in a way to reflect those sophisticated circumstances. And we would say that one of the things we really need to do is look at rate design and quote unquote modernize it to reflect current circumstances. And I'll just, even to make it more simple, in a lot of states, in a lot of markets, rates are charged on a volumetric basis. So you pay for your distribution services based on how much power you use. Well, with the onset of more energy efficiency, with more distributed generation, you might be using less volume on the grid, but yet the capital costs of the grid are still there. So how do we make sure that we can support our grid and still have it there and ensure that there's appropriate cost recovery? And that's really going to require some changes to rate design. And then finally, I'll just say, I spoke a lot about net metering. There are other models, I'm sure we'll talk about them today, that you might hear about in some other states that are starting to get, I don't want to say more popular, but populated around the country. One is called the value of solar and the value of solar tariff. That's been introduced in Austin, Texas, and recently in Minnesota. And a number of other states are thinking about that, and perhaps we can spend a little bit more chatting about that today. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Carrie. We're very fortunate to have two leading experts here, and I want to start. I would start with a few basic questions just to make sure we have an understanding of terms from some of the ideas that were thrown at you, and then we got some questions for each of Rick and Carrie, and then throw it open to you. Mainly, we'd like to hear your questions. Let me just start with one for Rick. A couple of times in your presentation, you mentioned the term power quality, and could you just elaborate on what that means? Because if I turn on the light and I have electricity, the light comes on. Or in the rare instance which there's an outage, it doesn't come on. I'm not really sure I know what the difference is between low quality and high quality electricity.
Right.
So you just elaborate what you mean by that?
Right. Term power quality is a pretty broad term, but the best way to illustrate that is when the lights flicker. Okay, you get a little surge or a spike on the system. It could be a welder next door that's using an electric welder that's drawing a big current and causes the building or some of the lights in the building to flicker. So that's a power quality problem. In the old days, not too much of a big deal, like I said, when you have analog systems. But flicker, transients, I don't know, any electrical engineers in the room? Oh, well, me neither. These are problems, and they're especially problems with sensitive electronic equipment like your phones. I'm sure you've had occasions where one of your electronic equipment burned out because of a problem on the grid. And that's one of the things that we've got to do a better job at is making sure that sensitive electronic equipment in homes, in offices, manufacturing processes, hospitals, so there's so many things plugging into the grid right now. Power quality is more important than ever.
Great. And Carrie, could you just define exactly what we mean by net metering? What does that term refer to?
Can I pull this picture up again?
Sure.
We can get a pop. So what it's really net energy metering. What that does, or what it is it allows what we would say behind the meter or customer-sided solar, those are typically the terms that are used, to receive, in most instances, this is a definition, a retail credit for the power that they put on the grid. So a net metered system is one that is still connected to the grid. It's not off-site. You might hear about solar that's off-grid, like you said. Entities that are off-grid wouldn't be net metered because they're not connected to the grid. Net metering is a policy tool that allows customers, and it's existed in some places for 20 or 30 years. This is not a new construct. I think the Massachusetts law on net metering was instituted in 1977, and upstairs they were talking about the New York one that's 25 years old. Is in place to allow customers that, and it's not just for solar. Some other, some states let other distributed generation resources get paid net metering, which again is a full retail credit for when you're connected to the grid and you're putting power on the grid. So hopefully that's
That's
clear
great.
enough?
And one other term you referred to might be worth explaining is.
Oh, that's okay.
Can I supplement that for a
Oh
minute?
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. Go right ahead.
Here's the way I explain it to my mother. A lot of you raised your hand when asked, do you know what net metering is? But this is the easy way to explain it. Let's stick with solar for a minute. When the sun starts to come up and the photovoltaic cells start to generate electricity, you start to slow the meter down. In other words, you're still using your power in your house. Refrigerators, things are on. You're slowing the meter down. The same thing when you turn all the lights off, you're slowing the meter down. At some point, and so you're paying. Let's say you're paying 11 cents a kilowatt hour. You're slowing the meter down. You're using less. It's not really like energy efficiency or conservation in a sense. You're still using the grid, and you're sending power back through the system, through the meter, and then back to the home. So you're slowing the meter down, and then when the sun is at its peak, and if you have more electricity generated than you're using, then you're selling power back to the utility at the retail rate. One of the controversies or concerns is, well, how do we price this? This is a different type of customer. A net metered customer isn't really like a regular customer in a sense. They're buying and selling electricity constantly, perhaps. Clouds come over, the utility demand comes back. And so it's a different type of customer in our mind. And so that's something to keep in mind. And also, in terms of variable prices and variable costs and fixed costs, the utility has variable costs like fuel. And so when you're generating your own power, you're saving the utility fuel. That's a good thing. We like that. We're happy to pay for the fuel that you save the utilities, but we do have fixed costs. If you have a $100 bill about per month, about $55 of that goes to the fixed costs to maintain the grid. Keep the wires, the folks that are in trucks that service the wires, that's a little over half of your bill. Those are fixed costs. Those can't be changed. So everybody who's connected to the grid needs to be sure that they pay for the fixed costs because they use the grid.
Great. Just one more terminology question. There was some reference to time of day pricing. Either of you want to just talk about what time of day pricing is? I sometimes find people are surprised by this idea. So just
Sure, I'll start.
Great.
Like we said, for residential customers, most customers are on a volumetric rate, which means the more you use, the more you pay. The less you use, the less you pay. Straight volume-based pricing. But for utilities, the peak power is the most expensive to use. We run our cheapest power plants first, and then there's a stack. They call it the generation stack. And so peak times of the day and peak times of the year, let's say, I'm sure in New York City, it's middle of August when everybody's air conditioners are on and it's 90 plus degrees out. That's the peak time 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe up to 7 o'clock. Really, 7 o'clock is peak time. People come home, crank on their air conditioners. That's the most expansive power. There are innovations in rates where customers can opt to switch to time of use pricing, put timers on your air conditioners, pre-cool your home before you get home. Now you have apps. You can set your thermostat, the Nest thermostat. I don't know if you've heard about that, where you can control your thermostat anytime. You can actually get prices. Some people call it prices to devices, sending prices to your refrigerator, sending prices to your air conditioner, having the compressors cycle on and off when electricity is cheaper, helps us trim the peaks, fill the valleys in demand. And this is a pricing mechanism that's getting more and more popular.
No, I think it's
Great. All right, so,
objective.
so then just to ask a different type of question for Rick. So I would guess here everybody in the audience has at least one cell phone, maybe more than one cell phone. I wouldn't be surprised if lots of people in this audience actually don't have landlines. And if they have landlines, they're not using them very much. And 25 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. So we've had a big transition in the telephone industry, moving from these centralized lines to cell phones. And what we were just hearing kind of feels like it might have some of the same quality to it, moving from centralized electric distribution more towards modular solar panels. Do you think that that's a useful analogy? Are we going to see a transition over the next 25 years in the electricity industry that's somewhat similar to what we've seen in the telephone industry in the last 25 years, or not?
I would have to say not, just because it's an easy substitute to substitute a landline for a cell phone. We have dual networks going on. I don't think we'll ever see dual transmission and distribution networks underground here in New York City or overground in outlying areas. But also, I think that, like we talked about, the grid is what enables these technologies and these new innovations. Batteries may get really cheap at some point, but battery chemistry, I don't know, any chemists in the room? Yeah. Okay, no electrical engineers, no chemists. Okay.
You got a policy and social science crowd, economists, exactly.
But battery chemistry is kind of tricky. Having backup generators, diesel generators paired with batteries. If you live in a cabin in the woods, you can do it, but you're not going to have the kind of services that you typically enjoy. You're going to have to be roughing it a little bit, and also the concept of startup power. When compressors come on, they need a big chunk of electricity to start up the motors and the compressors. And that's that peak, that spike. And it's hard to accommodate those technologies in the home or businesses with that kind of thing. So it's useful to talk about it, but I don't think it's a great analogy.
What do you think, Carrie?
So I would agree, except I think there's a little bit of a caveat, and I'd probably be a little bit more in the other direction, in that there are a lot of circumstances where we're seeing customers are maybe not yet going off grid, but they're creating their own, you probably heard of it, microgrids, right? Where they are looking at a system-wide approach where they can meet their needs with a few different tools, whether it be battery storage or other things that they're putting on site. Is it to the point, and I really don't like this phrase, but is it to the tipping point where people don't need the distribution grid? Absolutely not. But we should be aware that, and this is part of the challenges, is that companies and entities and things like universities, which think about microgrids a lot, actually, and the Department of Defense is a lot with their bases throughout the country, as they start to find it to be economic to be able to do that, and perhaps to be more reliable, and perhaps to be able to control their use and their costs a little bit or budget for them better, you may see some defection. It won't be universal, but one of the parts of the conversation is, what is that economic impact of that defection on the grid as some of those customers leave? So I would just say.
Leave or partially leave.
Yeah, or partially leave. Yeah, that's true.
More accurate to say partially.
And I was saying upstairs, and then I'll stop because I know people have questions. I'm probably a really good example of what's going on today well, at least for, middle-class people that live in the Northeast. I have a distribution system, I have a solar system on my house that I lease. I am a distribution customer of National Grid. I buy all my other power piece, my energy, from NRG, which is a wholesale, well, they do a lot of different things, but in this instance, they're selling me just my power, whatever else I might need. And I'm also, fourth, I'm a customer, although I don't pay for it, of an organization, a company called O-Power, which services utilities to provide data and information to end users. So I'm kind of like your average, new customer in the U.S. I mean, the only thing is I don't have an electric vehicle yet, or potential new customer. I've got a solar system. I'm a customer of the distribution system. I'm a customer of somebody else for data. And I buy my other generation from another party. That's 4 different companies. Never mind about what's happening on the wholesale side, right? So it's just kind of interesting and gets to your point a little bit about what's going on with the grid. It might not be as extreme as everybody's defecting from the grid, but there's all these other things happening.
Great. So one other question, and then want to hear if any of you have questions. And this I want to just focus specifically on solar. And I heard an interesting piece of data within the past week that got my attention, which is that in Germany, solar power costs roughly half, I was told, of what solar power costs here. And that's not with respect, that's excluding the impact of subsidies in either place, but just the pure cost of putting in a solar panel. And that the panels themselves are manufactured and shipped globally. So the panels themselves don't cost anything different in the United States and Germany. So I don't care if you're familiar with this. Why is it so much cheaper to install a solar panel in Germany than it is in the United States today?
Well, I'm going to hazard a guess. So I might be wrong, but this is my personal understanding of what may be happening. I think 2 things. One is, at one point, Germany, and you probably all know this, had significant subsidies, and Richard pointed that out. 4 or 5 years ago, made aggressive policy stance to move to install a lot more solar nationwide. So keep that in the back of your mind. I think there are probably 2 primary reasons right now. One is wide economies of scale, right? You had a major push all at once, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe, which gives you economies of scale. And the second kind of subset on the economies of scale argument is Germany is more or less one electricity grid and more or less one federal or national regulator. The US, we deal with 50 different markets, 50 different regulators. You looked at my map on the net metering rules, 50 different sets of rules. That adds to cost. And it adds to marketing costs, it adds to regulation costs, all those sorts of things, uncertainty that exist. So there's kind of they did it all at once, and that helps a lot with economies of scale. And then the second piece of it is just the nature of the beast here in the U.S. looks very different than countries in Europe, which were formerly, nationalized electricity companies that became privatized about 15 years ago. But still, you have this construct of one regulator and one set of rules.
Great. All right, we have microphones, and let me just, first hand that went up is right back there.
If you could state your name and affiliation.
Hi, I'm Madeline Silva with SEPA. My question is for Carrie. You said that rates need to reflect the benefits that solar customers are providing to the grid, and I just wanted you to kind of elaborate on what benefits solar customers are providing to the grid. And you mentioned, I think you said electric vehicles, but from where I've heard utilities complain that that's actually a hindrance to the grid because it puts more pressure on the grid.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to link electric vehicles and solar, although people are talking about them as being, in the future, perhaps things you could do simultaneously, EVs being a battery and solar being, a generator. So that issue aside, there are a couple things that people talk about in terms of solar benefits to the grid. So first, and I'll put this to the side, are, environmental benefits, right, that it's a clean resource. There are other clean resources, and centralized solar can do the same. But if you're talking about distributed generation, of course, we talk about the environmental aspects of it. The actual physical grid benefits, which is where there's a little bit of, wrangling. Richard did mention avoided fuel cost. avoided O&M cost, if you're avoiding building that next new generation plant, capital costs associated with that. In terms of physical aspects, access to that peak power at peak time, right? And then solar does, I know there's a lot, does it exactly overlap with some utilities peak? Maybe not, and maybe peaks are changing, but that's where technology is coming into play to be more useful. And then there's talk, value of avoided line losses, right? So when you buy from Central Station, you have avoided line losses when you distribute to the grid. So,
Yeah, if I can just add to that, the real issue is, how much does a utility pay for these services? How much services are they really getting, and how much do they pay? Obviously, save fuel, that's a solid one. If you're saving something in the future and you don't know what that future savings is, that's a guess. A hypothetical number, that's because it's a hypothetical number, because it's a guess, that's where the argument comes in, I think, because, if utilities are paying for something in the future, that means that and they're paying solar customers for that. That means the non-solar customers, if this is not right, the non-solar customers are subsidizing the solar customers, and that's really where the issue comes in, the cost shifting issue. If you're shifting costs from distributed customers to non-distributed customers.
and our only, not the only, but the primary issue with that is that there's always an assumption that there's a cost. And we would argue that you need to look at the benefits and the cost and look at what the net value is, not just assume it's always cost and that there are no benefits. Because I think even a number of utilities would say, yeah, there are benefits to distributed generation. We just need to figure out how to value those and also talk about the cost too.
Right.
Just to follow up, sorry, just to follow up quickly, like the avoided possibility in another power plant, to me, you show the penetration rates, and I guess I would ask EEI, how realistic is that?
The avoided cost of a power plant?
Like, having to build another
Well, up here in the Northeast, nobody needs to build a new power plant right now. Maybe in a few years we'll have to. So usually and you could probably speak better to this, usually what's going into the planning is, what's that next, 1,500 megawatt or 2,000 megawatt facility that we're going to need, 5 or 10 years out to deal with, either, additional load growth or what have you. So I was going to say this actually, in a few markets, in a few states, utilities are proposing to build new facilities. In Georgia, there's a $1.6 billion nuclear facility that is being constructed is kind of maybe halted at the moment. Can I say today that the 700 megawatts of new solar coming online in Georgia in the next 2 years exactly displaces that new nuclear facility? Maybe not, but at 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts, some combination of DG and solar and, our traditional peakers, smaller natural gas combined cycle plants, absolutely. It's not going to be solar alone that's going to completely displace Central Station, but some combination thereof.
Sir.
Yeah, I have a question about your cost shifting. Isn't anyone who's in... Sure. I have a question about your cost shifting. You say that when you put on solar and you're reducing the amount of electricity you're consuming, you're essentially shifting the costs to other customers. But doesn't energy efficiency do the same thing? Or an empty nester who doesn't use their apartment for 6 months out of the year, are they shifting the cost onto someone else? So isn't that an inherent problem with the rate design and not the technology?
Right, good point. There is a problem with rate design because you pay based on volume. If you're not there and you have no electricity use and your bill is zero, but you're still connected to the grid, you're still using the grid in a sense. You have the service at your home, and the utility doesn't know when you're coming home and turning all the lights on. So the utility has to have that level of service available. The same with solar or any other distributed generation. If your bill is zero, that's not fair. Your neighbor's paying for your access to the grid.
You back.
This is a lot tougher than this morning's conversation. Probably a lot more honest.
Hi, I'm Leah Grossman from CEPA. I have two questions. The first is on rate design, and the second is on new business models for investor-owned utilities. So for rate design, this question's for Carrie. So SCIA thinks that there are going to be changes in, or need to be changes in the rate design. If it isn't based on volume, what does SCIA think that it might be based off of? And then for Rick, for new business models for investor-owned utilities, what does EEI think might be in the future? If you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
So there are this is an evolving issue. And there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is let's just overhaul the whole thing and look at everything and open up rates and, reconfigure those. That's a scary prospect in many ways for many of us, for the utilities, for ratepayers, and even for us, because to engage in a process to make sure they're done right is really expensive. And in all these states and all these commissions. The second school, I don't say they're opposing schools of thoughts, but the kind of shorthand way of dealing with rate design issues that is getting proposed more often is to introduce a minimum bill construct or a fixed charge. SIA, when you keep saying SEPA, I keep thinking you mean the other SEPA. I'm like, wow, they got a lot of people here
School
today.
of International Public
I know.
Affairs,
The minimum bill kind of approach is, in the past 6 months, has probably been proposed to 3 or 4 different markets. And that's just a rough idea, but basically what you would have is a commission would go through a process and determine what is kind of a fair minimum bill across different rate classes that you would assign to all customers, not just to DG customers or battery customers or whatever, to cover the reasonable and prudent fixed cost of the distribution grid that the utility needs to have.
Yeah, second part, but I'm going to comment on that very quickly, and then I'll take the question about business models. I didn't forget. The thing about rates, one alternative that a lot of people are talking about is a 3-part rate for residential customers. And, perhaps we start with distributed generation customers. Like I said, they're different types of customers. Customers don't like to be forced to go on to a different rate. This is where the politics come in, because when you change rates, there are winners and losers. You could sit in your room and with a, calculate the, what's the best rate and the fairest rate, but there are going to be winners and losers. And believe me, the losers, we will hear from them. And your governor will, and your legislators and your utility regulators. This is, we haven't talked about politics yet, but I'm sure if you've been studying this or reading about this a little bit, the politics is getting really ugly, and it's getting uglier. Personal attacks on utility employees with bodyguards going into rate case hearings. I mean, this is no joke. This is what's happening, and it's something that we have never dealt with before. So, we got to deal with the politics. But in terms of the rates, a lot of people are talking about moving distributed generation customers to a 3-part rate, for example. And if I can explain this very easily, a fixed charge, say we have $100. So a third of that is a fixed charge. Then we have a demand charge based on the spike in demand. You pay more the higher your monthly usage goes up. And the third part is a volumetric charge in terms of kilowatt hours, how fast the meter spins. And that gets you to a better place in terms of fairness, in terms of fixing rates. And that's a huge, there are thousands of people who do this as for a living, and we need people like that. So if you guys are looking for jobs, rate managers, great job. Check into it. Real quickly, the issue about business models, I'll make this real simple. Utility business models, I think you'll see more and more utilities providing more products and services to customers rather than a commodity. Kilowatt hour, that's a commodity. Products and services, meaning energy services coming into the home or business, installing your thermostat, replacing your windows, insulation, whatever the cheapest thing is first. These have very high paybacks for consumers, but there's a barrier. There's just a market barrier for customers fixing their home. And we can talk about that for hours. But the utility, as a trusted energy advisor coming into the home, financing the improvements on your bill, I think you're going to see more and more of that in terms of different business models for utilities.
Thank you, Rick. Let's see, we've got a number. Yes. Are you? That's
You
what
never,
you recognize.
I was wondering if you could talk about solar thermal, which you haven't talked about, and wouldn't another source for utilities be the wind power? I heard that off the shore of Long Island is, and so what are your thoughts, even though it might be out of, your theme, of solar thermal in comparison to the electrical solar, and your viewpoint on wind power in the state of New York? Thank you.
What was the second part?
Could you repeat the second question? We didn't get that.
The wind power,
Oh,
how that adds, you're talking about I suppose, a basket full of different vegetables from which we get our source of energy.
great.
And so I was
So solar
throwing
power-
wind power in the mix, and
Got
I'm
it.
also asking to explain the difference to the audience, or what do you feel about solar thermal
Got it.
on
Solar,
residential
thermal, and wind power.
homes?
Thank you.
So I guess on solar thermal and wind, generally speaking, although no, not universally true. Well, let's start with wind. Wind typically is less about distributed generation and more about, larger scale facilities. There is distributed generation wind that folks install and do around the country, but the historic kind of growth in wind has been, multiple turbines on a larger scale being installed. And that's just because that's how the economics work, that's how the technology works. I think you might see more DG in wind, but that'll in part depend on what happens with this conversation in distributed generation and net metering. Wind, is probably, the policy conversation is in some ways a little bit more mature. There's more pushback going on with wind now about where it's sited and all that sort of things. And I just saw something today that, I don't know, something like 3,000 jobs were lost in the wind industry last year in the U.S. Was it 30,000? Thanks. So, there's a transformation going on there as well. In terms of solar thermal, if you're kind of referring to, larger scale solar thermal facilities, that's kind of the same thing, is that's a technology that is commercialized and is installed, but it only, the scale of it only works in certain, parts of the U.S. I talked a little bit about what's going on in the Southwest, and I suspect that will continue. That's how the economics work there. I suspect we might see more of that in Texas, that sort of thing. So it's the conversation there, the economics are different than they are for distributed generation. And it's more about a larger wholesale facility than it would be a distributed generation or customer-sited facility.
Do you think there's a role for solar thermal on a residential basis because hot water heating?
So, yeah, we are engaged in a lot of conversations about solar heating and cooling on the residential level. It's a different conversation because it's not an electricity conversation. It's more about in a lot of markets, it's about a natural gas. You're talking about the comparison with prices of natural gas. So in Massachusetts, New York, Colorado, California, and a few other markets, it's definitely, not definitely, the economics seem to look a little bit better for those markets and growth in those markets. It's less so in some of the other places that I didn't mention, simply because the math doesn't kind of work out that it would be worth it for a residential customer to install those systems yet. Now, that could change. It could change with economies of scale. It could change with change in technology. But right now, that's kind of how things are playing out.
Yeah, right there.
I'm Chaim Grushko. I'm a student in sustainability management here at Columbia. This question's for Rick. You mentioned, you discussed making the grid more resilient to natural disasters. And since the attack on the transformer in California last April, the Wall Street Journal has been running articles about physical security of the grid against attack. Very recently, I think in the past few days, they put out an article if 9 transformers are hit during peak August demand, it could take out much of the U.S. grid for months. Do you think that the risks are being overstated? And what can be done to make the grid more secure, aside from the longer term, more integrated smart grid solutions that are already being discussed?
Sure. Yes. No, that's a huge concern. We can't have, for national security reasons, we can't have folks taking down transformers. The industry is working very closely with the federal government and the state government in partnership to try to understand, what is the real threat and how to overcome it. Everyone should know, though, when he's referring to the Metcalf transformer in California, when that was taken out, there was no outage. The smarter systems allow you to reroute the power in other places. So, that is a good test of the system. And like I said, we are taking this very seriously with the Office of Homeland Security, FBI, looking at this. I would never say a threat is overstated like this. We really want to make sure that we understand what the threat is, what the risks are, and take appropriate precautions. But we also have to do it at the lowest cost way. We have to be serious about this and really have to deal with better security, better cameras, fences, the traditional hardening of the security around the systems. But I think we're working real hard to make sure that the threat is reduced. But good question.
Right next to you and then right behind you.
Just a quick comment on that. This is not my area of expertise, but I have heard certain experts, one whom will go unnamed, but he's, outspoken on this issue, talk about how a distributed grid actually can be one of the, not the only solutions, but a more distributed grid helps to mitigate some of those risks.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, well, given that solar panel costs have decreased so much during the last few years, what do you think would be the appeal of industries and large corporations to adopt solar panel technology to produce their energy now instead of in the future, since their costs are still decreasing?
So do you mean end users or do you mean utilities building large scale?
I mean industries. I mean the large warehouses, corporations.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, they already are, and I think demand, as costs continue to come down, that will continue to encourage demand. And, many of those sorts of facilities already have adopted, not universally, but our top 20 customer list include, folks that I already mentioned, like Johnson & Johnson and universities and those things, are adopting solar as a resource. They're still connected to the grid for the most part, too, as Richard has pointed out. We expect that to continue as costs come down, but again, it's going to happen where retail rates, where what we call would be grid parity, you can beat what the retail rate is. So that sort of adoption, absent some environmental or sustainability goal, companies are going to start to do it more if they see that they can, do it, get their electricity really, quite frankly, at a cheaper rate, or help with their budgeting process. So I know I've already gone too long. Let me give you kind of an offshoot of that. A number of school districts in the U.S., Massachusetts, New Jersey, and California in particular, have started to adopt solar technology, not for the educational reasons and the societal reasons, but also because if they can predict 30% of their electricity prices for the next 15 years because they have a PPA with a leasing company or a developer, that actually helps their budgeting process. So they're actually using that sort of thing to help them with their budgeting. So that is contributing a little bit. That's a little bit different reason than you talked about.
So if I understood, it's kind of more stable prices, right?
Yes. If you're an end user, whatever, school committee or a large, commercial facility, what have you, and I engage in a PPA with a developer that says to me, you're 30% of your electricity is going to be 10 cents for the next 15 years, or there's some kind of schedule that's laid out. That's a guaranteed price for that percentage of your load. So you can budget that and predict for it. One thing, just because of the crowd that we're in, that some of you might be interested in, given the name of the institute, there's a large trade case going on right now between Germany, the U.S., China, Japan, India, whatever. It's getting complicated. It's very interesting to watch. I think it would be a great case study for some of you to look at the impact of the solar market, of the outcome of that case, which could actually raise panel prices in the third quarter of this year or not, depending on if duties are actually applied to imported panels. Just thought I'd mention all this.
Thank you. So we're running out of time. I've got lots of hands. Why don't we try to get a number of questions in at once and then just have comments? And then I want to actually close with a follow-up question to Rick's comment about jobs and get your thought about jobs. So you've had your hand up for a while, and you have one right here.
Thank you. Pavel Koning, business school alum. So it looks like there are some tensions between traditional utilities and operators of distributed generations, such as Solar City or Sun Edison. And perhaps there is a political process coming on to determine what is a fair resolution. But if you could give a view of the arguments of distributed generations and maybe also some sources of power, kind of what can be their economical leverage in this process?
Great, thank you. And before we answer, why don't we, right here.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline from NYU, and my question is: although although New York State is one of the highest in terms of electricity rates, it still ranked as one of the lowest in solar power generation in 2013. And I was just curious about what policies do you think should be implemented to kind of increase the rate at which solar power is.
There's a really quick answer to that. Watch what's going to happen on Earth Day in the state. Okay, the governor's issuing a final decision on expanding their program significantly here. So,
thank you.
Right here and here, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Hi, my name is Yaniv, and my company is a commercial solar developer here in the Northeast, also a member of SIA, obviously. My question is about the expected rate in the next, I want to say, 3 years, specifically in the Northeast, with Indian Point being shut down and just all the natural disasters happening here. What do you think would happen with the prices here? We already saw a 20% increase in 2014, potentially another increase in 2015. What do you think, how will it affect customers, the adoption of solar energy? For us as developers, we see already more interest, but wanted to see your perspective on it.
Thank you. And right here.
Hello, and my question is about when do you expect a change to the new pricing models for utilities? And how is this change going to look like, this transition going to look like, especially because for first movers, specific competitive advantages and disadvantages might rise?
Thank you. So I've got really 3 topics. Distributed generation, kind of the arguments pro and con in the political process around this. The Indian Point shutdown and its impact on prices here, and then changes in new pricing models for utilities. So start with Rick, if you have any comments on any of those, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, let me, all these questions tend to get to pricing, okay? And it always comes back down to pricing, rates. Like we talked about, we have a very unusual way of pricing electricity, especially for residential customers. By the way, commercial and industrial customers don't have volumetric rates, only volumetric rates for the most part. There are a lot of variabilities, and customers, commercial and industrial customers have options, and they opt into different rates based on what's best for them. I think what we're going to see is more and more options for customers to opt in to different types of rates, choices for customers, partner the rates with the technologies, the prices with technologies, and then you optimize your use of electricity and energy as a whole. And so I think that's going to be the issue. The tough part is, well, how do you calculate that? How do you know you're on the best rate? And that's up to the utilities and the third party, your electricians, your heating and cooling folks, to really work with customers to understand what's the best rate and how do you optimize not only the rate but the technologies, your refrigerator, your heat pump. How do you decide how to optimize your investment in energy services?
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with that answer. I guess what I would say is there's a general expectation that on average across the U.S., rates, the slope of the curve of rates, they'll continue to go up. And that would be for all aspects of the bill. And that's because, quite frankly, this is my personal view, we've kind of gotten off cheap in the U.S., relative to other countries and what other folks pay for electricity in the developed world. The percentage that we pay for our electricity services for a pretty reliable service has been pretty low relative to our income. That's one thing. The second is there are investments that need to be made, whether it's solar or not. We do need to upgrade the grid for security reasons, for reasons that the investments haven't been able to be made for 20 or 30 years because utilities didn't know if they were going to get cost recovery for those investments, because of storm resiliency, other things. So significant investments will be made in the grid, not just because of what you and I want as customers, but because of just technological changes that have to occur to make sure we keep the reliability sound. So our rates are going to go up. I'm not blaming the IOUs for that. That's just a fact of life that we have to make investments to continue to have the grid perform in the way that we expect it to be in the U.S. Here in New England, there are circumstances that are changing. I live in Massachusetts. We are at the end of the natural gas pipeline, which means, there's limited natural gas in the winter when we need it for heating purposes as well as generation. That's causing prices to go up. It caused, kind of a big stir this, winter in the wholesale markets because some not utilities, I don't say utilities per se, but what we would call load-serving entities were caught short. They hadn't hedged against gas prices going up. And so there was, there's going to be an increase in our fuel cost adjustment for this past winter. So, we face that in a region, particularly up here, where there's not a lot of load growth happening, meaning there's not a lot of new demand happening. And we don't have a lot of new, plants being proposed because the economics just aren't there to put them online, merchant plants. And we need to make investments in the grid. So regardless of what happens on the DG side, there will be transformations in the grid and price changes.
Great. Well, Carrie, Rick, there's obviously a lot of interest here, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody. Come up afterwards if these folks have time to stay around. I'm sure we can have some informal chats. Looking out on the crowd, I would estimate about half of the people here are students, and many of these students may be looking for jobs. If they were interested enough to come here, they might actually be interested in looking for jobs in this area. So you already had one comment along these lines, Rick, which I thought was kind of interesting, but I thought I might just close with any impromptu reflections or advice you might have for people looking for jobs in this area. Is this a good area to be looking for jobs, and what would you tell them to do?
Well, as a parent of two mid-20-year-olds, I'm very aware of these kind of questions. But I would have to say that this is an exciting area, and there's got to be a lot of interesting jobs available in this area because the dynamics are changing. There's a lot of new ideas and creativity needed, and frankly, a lot of utilities are looking to bring creative, innovative people into the company to change the corporate culture. We talked a little bit about that earlier today, about the corporate culture of the utilities. It is changing. It is becoming much more dynamic, and it's a really exciting area to work, not just utilities, but the whole industry.
I'm going to sound like very old, probably relative to what some of you are thinking, but I think some of the skill sets that are needed are even just fundamental things. Someone just said to me upstairs, where did you start? And I kind of started working at a utility and a public utilities commission. And I understand the fundamentals of how the grid works. That enables me, I think, to do my job pretty well. I can have a conversation with Richard and have an honest conversation about what the grid looks like, what are the pros and cons, what's going on with pricing. So working at a utility, even working at a public utilities commission, like getting the fundamentals of the market will really go a long way for you to have, I would say, a longer, deeper, wider career ultimately, because you'll understand how the grid works, how the economics work really well. And the connections that you make in those sorts of places are really good. And of course, we welcome folks in the solar industry without doubt.
Well, thank you. We're very fortunate to have two leading national experts. Could you please join me in giving them a big hand?